How do you get beyond the idea of community in which people who are together band together? And instead, how is it possible in cities for people who are uh, not the same, nonetheless to band together in making things in the city? Well, I'm very glad to be back at the Hay Festival, one of my favorite places to talk about books. And I'm particularly glad to be back at this session, which is dedicated to the thought of Edgar Morin. Edgar Morin has been a great influence on me because his work is an attempt to integrate nature and culture in a way which gives culture a kind of formal role as something more than articulating nature, but actually making it. And it seems to me today, he's lived a good deal of time. It seems to me that today his thought is more necessary than ever, because it is a way of thinking about issues like climate change and the shaping of what we think of as the natural environment according to rules which are derived from cultural practices and cultural understandings between people. So I'm delighted that you pay homage to him as I do in my own work. I'll tell you a little about what I have been doing for the last 10 years, which is a project called the Homo Faber Project. And it's an attempt to look at human beings as makers. And I've tried to look at three kinds of making in which they engage. One is the relation between material understanding and making, between the head and the hand, which is a project about craftsmanship. And the second is an effort to understand how people do this together, about the collaborative ways in which people make things, about cooperation and its difficulties. And the third part of this project is about how the urban environment in particular is shaped, which is a subject that goes back to a preoccupation I've had for all my life, which is how do we actually make places? And just to give you a heads up on the problematic in each of these, and then how I see them fit together. In the craftsman, what I'm interested in is the notion of something that is deeply, deeply fraught in modern capitalism. That is the relation, the desire to make something well for its own sake. In capitalism, that's, I can't say it's a negative, but it's a neutral concept. If it sells, it doesn't matter whether it's good or bad. The sociological setting for that is that a lot of capitalist labor erased the kind of mental activity which I think has to go into doing something well, which is to make things in which you're engaged by the hand in material production. There's a great danger in that of being nostalgic about crafts as they were in the past. We're inventing all sorts of new kinds of crafts today. Medical crafts, which engage thinking in thinking with one's hands, even as I found in teaching at MIT, that whole dimension of craft work, of trying to materialize how you think, is something that goes on when people do really good work in creating computer programs. In fact, there is a whole movement called Craft and Code, which is trying to raise the level of a lot of commercial code, like most of the code written by Microsoft, which is very mediocre in quality, by having people try to learn from what craftsmen of an older generation did. So what interests me in this is how that process actually occurs, and what kind of narrative goes on in trying to do things well for its own sake. I think there's a kind of grounding in the human body for that, which is that our brains developed largely because we had the kind of digital things in our hands which allowed us to manipulate objects in ways that other mammals cannot. And our brains are hardwired to the notion that tactile experience is a way to think, that you think while you're actually touching something, manipulating it, shaping it, smelling it, hearing it, and so on. And the effort that I made in that book is to try and bring that kind of basic way of thinking about making that is embedded physically in us as human beings into a economy and a society which divorces the head and the hand. As I say, it's partially a capitalist thing about material production, which is indifferent to quality. It's also a question about the ways in which we can recredit again manual activities in the society at large. So it has a productive and it has a stratification element to it. That's my first book. People can't do this alone, and that's the proposition that I look at in the second book called Together in English. And what I'm interested in there is a fundamental contradiction, which was signaled to me by Edgar Morin, which is the distinction between solidarity and cooperation. In solidarity, we are doing the same things with people who we think understand us or who we understand. And we're doing things that are shared between us. Sometimes think of this as a commons. But in life, we're frequently thrown together with people who are different from us, whose lives we can't understand nor should pretend to, people who offend us. And the notion that I had is, what kind of cooperation can we have with people like that? With people, how can we transcend solidarity in order to have a kind of cooperation with those who are different? And I referred to my first book about this, because craftsmanship, because I took the workshop as a model for ways in which people who are very unlike could work together. Although in this case, I focused more on workshops that are not like the medieval workshop, but are modern laboratories or musical cooperation of this sort. You may know that I have another life as a musician, and it's always struck me that the whole issue in cooperating with other people who play different instruments, as in an orchestra or in a band, is that you are trying to not play in unison, get on the same page, but find a way of cooperating with people who are doing something very different. And it led me into the real substance of that book, which is not the explanation which binds people together, but nonverbal forms of communication. How physically we signal to other people what we are doing, how we cooperate with our bodies rather than through kind of verbal contracts or verbal understandings of being all on the same page. And I'm very interested in nonverbal communication as an artist, but I also think it has a lot to do with the social domain outside of art, which is most of the ways in which we get along with people who are different are not articulated verbally as to what we share. It interested me, particularly with crowds of people who are diverse people in cities. And that brought me to the third volume in the Homo Faber series, which is called Building and Dwelling in English, a title I regret, because this book is really, it's about open cities. How do you open up the city so that it's porous? It's a place where people who are different can live together, do things together without requiring that people share a solidarity. How do you get beyond the idea of community in which people who are together band together? And instead, how is it possible in cities for people who are not the same, nonetheless to band together in making things in the city? So in this third volume, I look at a lot of the issues about construction, material construction, and cooperation, workshop-like conditions, as they apply to creating open urban forms. And conversely, I look at the kinds of open urban forms which allow people who, in a complex situation, to live together. And I'm interested in the way in which porosity in urban space, for instance, means that all sorts of differences can leak into a field or into a space. The kind of antithesis of a gated community, which is non-porous, which is solid. I'm very interested in incomplete forms in architecture, which require people to live in the forms together in order to develop them. And I'm very much against a kind of architectural ethic which gives buildings or spaces to people fully made for them to inhabit. And finally, I'm interested in the whole area of co-production, which is something in my life as a planner I've always tried to practice, which is how can makers and users work together to produce a kind of open form which can evolve in time and which serves the needs of people, but not merely in one generation, but in future generations. So that's what I've been doing. I have been trying to understand human beings as makers in the pursuit of making well, making it well together, and making a place in which these acts of making can occur. And that's me. So as I say, that's me. I'd be very receptive, indeed grateful, for comments from you who have listened to this talk. And I think the best way to manage this is for you to send questions to the Hay Festival, and they'll convey those to me, and I'll try to respond as best I can. My only request to you is make them short. So don't ask me to give another lecture, but I would be very interested to know what you make of this view of Homo Faber. Thank you very much.